morning, everyone. The FSC, Financial Services Council of New Zealand, is delighted to welcome our two guest speakers from Deloitte today to talk about cybersecurity trends. The first is Rajesh Pradhan of Deloitte, and he is a director in Deloitte's risk advisory practice with over 20 years of cybersecurity and privacy experience. He has experience from the USA, Australia, New Zealand, and has helped many organisations across a range of sectors implement their cybersecurity and privacy programs and solutions. Werner Swiegelaar is a manager within Deloitte's risk advisory practice and has more than 15 years of cybersecurity and technology experience. He's worked across a range of sectors and industries, both in New Zealand and South Africa. Cybersecurity is a growing awareness in New Zealand, particularly for businesses, as we have experienced some attacks from the time of COVID and continuing on our regulators and in private business. So we hope this webinar will help give you some insight into some of the attack trends and the response trends and what you can do to best guard against these attacks in your business. And I will hand over to our team from Deloitte.
Great, thanks, Carissa. Good morning, everyone. What we wanted to do in this presentation was really just give you a sense of some of the trends that we're seeing in the market. As Carissa mentioned, we've been helping a lot of organisations. Personally, I've helped a lot of organisations in the US and also in New Zealand around just trying to understand their cybersecurity landscapes, understand the threats, and really try to help them sort of mitigate some of those threats in terms of implementing some controls, upskilling their capability in the area of cyber, and actually trying to really mitigate those threats. And also on the privacy side, because we're seeing a lot of data privacy breaches as well, and obviously with the new regulation that's just come through in 2020, we'll touch on that as well a little bit. So maybe just flip to the next slide. In terms of what we wanted to cover in this session was really just around talking about how we believe cyber has evolved and what we constitute in terms of cyber. How do we think about it? We want to just understand some of the questions that maybe some of the executives and board members are now asking, which is great to see, and it's really trying to get that awareness at that executive level, because that's very important for organisations to actually make sure that this is being discussed at the board table as well. Then Werner's just going to cover off some cyber attack trends, both globally and in New Zealand, what we're seeing in terms of some of those attacks that Chris had mentioned. And then I'm just going to touch on some things around sort of the incident management process and the aftermath of the breach in terms of the stages of that. And then I'll briefly touch on cyber insurance. Obviously, I would imagine a number of you will be familiar with cyber insurance, but I'll touch on that briefly just to give you some more insight into that, and a brief touch on privacy, and then we'll sort of talk about some of the solutions and things that you can do to help mitigate this risk. Werner will also touch on some personal tips and tricks, especially in the days of COVID, where obviously a lot of people are working from home. So really just some safety tips around being cyber safe online. So when we think about cybersecurity, it's quite a large field, and different folks have probably different interpretations of what this means. From our perspective, it's really anything to do with any sort of business transaction that's through an online medium, anything in the digital world, anything through an electronic means. So it's a very large ecosystem. We talk about as cyber being everywhere. It really permeates the entire ecosystem. It's very complex and ever-changing. So what this means really from a day-to-day perspective is that when you're doing your financial transactions, when you're doing banking, whether you're getting healthcare through your healthcare provider, getting insurance online, maybe there's manufacturing plants or electricity providers that are actually producing these services. They're obviously all sort of picking up that data through sensors, whether it's through SCADA systems or sensors on the production line. All of that data is fed back into computers to control that data and make use of it. And so that whole ecosystem is very complex. it's quite large. And when we think of cybersecurity, what we're talking about from a very simplistic term is the compromise or the disruption of any of those services to end consumers, but also the breach of confidential data. So it's the attack of where attacks are trying to grab that personal data. It might be intellectual property, it could be personal information, it could be financial data, things that are very important to the heart of a business. And if that got compromised, that could have quite damaging effects. And what they're trying to do, the attackers obviously sell that on the dark web, monetize that, do insurance fraud and like identity theft. So that's really what we're trying to do here from a cybersecurity perspective, is protect that ecosystem from a disruption of service or compromise of sensitive information. This has become quite a tricky area in the sense that the ecosystem is now quite large, and because of the introduction of obviously cloud services, which can be good in terms of their a lot of cloud providers put a lot of effort into security and a lot of capability into that field, but it just opens up the enterprise. So you have a lot of data going up into the cloud. You have a lot of contractors and third parties. We're seeing supply chain attacks now that Werner will touch on. So that whole ecosystem is now quite wide, and you've got people coming and going from the organization. So controlling access to the data or controlling the flow of that information becomes very difficult when you've got that extended enterprise. And really, it's often said that it's not an IT issue anymore. I'm sure you've heard that many times now, but it is really an all of business problem. And because it is quite a wide ecosystem, that's really what makes it such a difficult problem. And that's why you need the executives and board really understanding what the risks and threats are, so that you can actually collectively try to fight against it. In terms of some of the questions that executives are now asking, you've got the likes of board members are obviously interested now. We do a lot of dashboards now to try to articulate some of the risks and some of the maturity and programs that are happening across the organization. And that can be quite subjective, but really gives insight in terms of, are we investing in the right security capabilities to actually protect our organization? The CIA may be interested in, are we making the best use of our cloud initiatives to reduce the risk? CFO could be interested in cyber insurance, that we'll touch on later on. The CRO, for example, is obviously in terms of mitigating the risk. Are we actually prioritizing our program to effectively mitigate the risk and maybe get back into risk appetite for your organization? There's also the business in terms of making sure that they're understanding the critical business processes. So what are the processes that are actually going to affect an organization if there was a cyber breach or cyber attack? Yeah, if there are critical business processes, we need to understand those and understand the important IT assets and systems that are supporting those, so that we can actually protect against attacks and actually be able to respond and bring those business processes back online. So these are all extremely important questions, not always easy to answer, but there are methods in terms of trying to systematically go about understanding the risks and then actually putting in programs to address these risks. I might pause there and just hand it over to Werner, who's going to cover off some of the global cyber attacks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Raj. The next couple of slides is going to talk around the global cyber attacks, as well as some security trends that we're actually noticing within New Zealand. When we're looking to actually understand a cyber attack, we have 5 key questions. We're trying to understand who, why, how, what, and the impact. When we look at who, what we're trying to understand is who we're protecting our organization against. Is this a malicious insider? Is it careless employees? Is it a nation state sponsored attack that's trying to attack our organization? We're also trying to understand why. So why are they trying to attack our organization? Is it for financial gain? Is it for political or competitive edge? There's always a reason why somebody's trying to attack the organization. The how is generally trying to understand what type of tools or techniques could potentially be used against our organization. and what do we need to do to protect ourselves. So this could be common attack methods, whether they could be using phishing attacks or more sophisticated and nation-state sponsored attacks. When we look at the what, we're actually trying to understand what assets the attackers are interested in. Is it that they're after our critical data? Is it after any sensitive corporate information? Or are they just trying to gain access to our critical systems and critical infrastructure? And finally, we're looking to actually understand the impact. So if we were hit by a cyber breach or a cyber incident, what is the actual impact? Is there any regulatory fines that potentially could be coming the organization's way? Is there going to be a breach, a loss of confidentiality or confidence within the organization in terms of that actual incident happening? What we do is we're looking at how attackers are commonly compromising organizations today. So number one is still phishing. So phishing through emails, and or more regularly, you can also do it through what we refer to as smishing, through SMS, or vishing through phone calls. It's still a low investment, but potentially a high return on investment. When we look at privileged abuse, this is talking around how organizations with poor privilege management are managing their administrative accounts within the systems. If you don't have visibility or control over those accounts, if an attacker does gain access to your infrastructure or your organization, they potentially have the ability to create a persistence within your network that you'll never, or you'll very struggle to actually eradicate. Stolen credentials, it's still one of the most widely used attack methods. People reuse a lot of passwords on a lot of online services and websites. And if you don't know that your account was breached, and if the provider that your account was hosting your account was not aware of good security practices, inadvertently, if you reuse that password, you could potentially be compromising other services that you subscribe to. Misconfigurations, this is some of the more common ones appearing, and this could be across your internal infrastructure, but also the more ever-changing cloud landscape. It is a very broad space, and there's a lot of opportunity for various things to actually go wrong within that space, where you could actually inadvertently leave a port or a service open that could then provide a gateway for attackers. DDoS, which is touching a little bit more closer to home within New Zealand. So more recently, as we've heard, the NZX, where they've been targeted by DDoS attacks, but also smaller organizations are being taken down where their services are unavailable to their clients. And more recently, there's been a lot of heat within the supply chain attack industries. So this is where organizations are actually targeting companies through any vulnerabilities within their supply chain. The most recent one and the more well-known one was the SolarWinds incident, where they gained access to over 30,000 customers worldwide, and some of them in critical infrastructure areas as well. When we're looking to understand the pandemic cyber risk and what COVID-19 as an impact to the global cybersecurity community meant, is that we've seen a 59% increase in COVID-19 themed phishing attacks. Criminals were starting to take advantage of COVID-19 and the black swan event that the world found itself in at that stage. If we look at the bottom left-hand side, looking at the number of malicious websites related to COVID-19. So as you can see, back in 2020, as COVID became news within the world, there was slowly but surely an increase up until March, where there was a drastic increase in the number of malicious sites that was pushing either fake news about COVID or was providing any sort of sites where users would be able to enter information and potentially be used for credential harvesting or gathering personal or financial information. When we're looking at some of the common lures that organizations and users were targeted through with COVID-19 themed attacks, it's through malicious attachments. So things being sent through email, any malicious links where they're actually getting a user to click on a link. It could also have been through the general email and just general spam. As I mentioned on the left-hand side, it's fake pages, fake sites, fake landing pages, business email compromise, and also then going from there into downloaders and malware, the spreading of disinformation, and lastly also targeting users to do credential phishing to gain access to any potential credentials for other services. When detecting, responding, and monitoring for a data breach, what we can actually see based on the study that was conducted by Deloitte as well as Ponemon, where they review the state of data breach, it takes on average 197 days now to actually identify a breach within an organization. It takes an additional 69 days to contain the breach, and on average, it's about approximately 280 days for the average time to actually identify and contain and potentially remediate any actions from there. What we've picked up out of the 40% of surveyed organizations, we found that only 40% of the manufacturing companies admitted that they actually had a breach or have been affected by a cyber incident in the past year. We also noted that 52% of data breaches were caused by malicious attacks. One of the key statistics here is that only 41 of businesses actually monitored their critical infrastructure continuously to try and spot and prioritize and deal with any potential threats to the organization. Just to put it into context, that the cost of a DDoS attack against a site could cost you as little as $10 per hour. And the cost of a verified and a hacked Gmail account is $155. One of the most infamous quotes from Dmitry Alperovich, who was the McAfee vice president for threat research at the time, said that of the world's biggest firms, there are just two kinds: those that have known that they've been compromised, and those that still haven't realized they have been compromised. This is more true in today's age if we look at some of the more sophisticated supply chain attacks, where a lot of organizations haven't been aware of the fact that they've been targeted, and they've just been running software that's been supplied by a third-party vendor, which they've assumed has been safe. When we're looking to understand some cybersecurity trends, so what has Deloitte as well as CERT New Zealand observed within New Zealand? So some of the key statistics of responding to a typical cyber breach could cost a small to medium-sized business anything from $20,000 to $250,000 per incident. When you start looking at medium to large size organizations, that could be in excess of $250,000. One of the largest incidents that we've actually assisted a client with, and a single fraud event, cost the organization $1.2 million. Some of the largest cyber insurance claims that we've actually seen has been $450,000. And then just to put this into perspective, global cybercrime losses in 2020 was estimated at approximately $945 billion US. For 2021, it is currently on track to actually exceed $1 trillion before this year closes. Some of the cybersecurity trends that CERT New Zealand has actually observed over the last year is that there's been a 65% increase in the number of incidents reported from 2019 to 2020. There's also been a 1,980% increase in the number of reported malware incidents from 2019 to 2020. One of those can be attributed to the Emotet malware. So the Emotet malware was originally created back in 2014 as a banking malware that was essentially looking to attack organizations and attack individual users to gain access to financial information. So this is harvesting banking information for logging in or entering your credit card details. So as you can see, the number of malware attacks reported late 2020 in Q3 and Q4, there was a huge spike, and this was attributed to the Emotet malware. What we have noticed is globally, through the various collaboration across local as well as international governments, the Emotet malware backbone, or the botnet, was essentially taken down in January, and we should see a drastic decrease in those number of attacks. Looking at the financial harm to New Zealand businesses over the last couple of years, so where the recorded financial loss in 2017 was only sitting at $5.3 million, we can see that in 2020, the estimated and the loss of where CERT New Zealand has helped organizations is currently sitting at almost $17 million. From a global trends perspective, as we discussed earlier on around breach credentials or any credentials that were reused within any services or sites online, The way you would protect yourself against that is to potentially implement multi-factor authentication. So if we look at some of the key statistics, and this is through various services that were reviewed, this is through LastPass, as well as an organization called DIO, which is quite well known for multi-factor authentication services to businesses, that only 50% of businesses globally are actually using multi-factor authentication. If we look at the industries that are leading the percentages of where employees are actually using multi-factor authentication, it's expected that within the technology and the software industry, we're seeing quite a high uptake of 37%. But when we go down to your manufacturing, and this is where Raj talks around your SCADA systems, your industrial control systems, it is more difficult to actually implement multi-factor authentication in those systems, hence a lower adoption rate. When we look at the bottom left around multi-factor authentication usage by age, we see that the younger generation is more adept and implementing and utilizing multi-factor authentication. And as we progressively move down as users within the lower 55 to 65 range, there is a lower adoption rate of multi-factor authentication. And this could be through either being unaware of the capability or not having access to the right education. And then just the key statistics, most organizations are now making use of Microsoft online services, and this could be to run their email, which is Microsoft O365, or any of the Azure-based services. And out of a study that was actually completed, we found that there was 97% of organizations that were surveyed that was not using multi-factor authentication. More surprising and more worrying, though, is 78% of those organizations that were surveyed, the administrators, the people responsible for running those platforms on a daily basis, did not actually make use of multi-factor authentication.
Thanks, Werner. So just wanted to kind of highlight also that it's become quite easy now for the hackers to obviously gain tools and the know-how around actually compromising organizations. You would have heard that potentially that the NSA's tools have been leaked on the internet, and so the hackers now have that in terms of simplest, easy ways to get into computers. You know, all of these exposures now are sold on the dark web in terms of the weaknesses of organizations. So there's a lot of information there that attackers are using against organizations. So unfortunately, that's become it's quite an increase of that, and that's just making the attackers' job a lot easier. And obviously, they have a lot of time. That, as Werner mentioned, you know, that they can be in there for days, weeks, years, moving around an organization to compromise data and disrupt an organization. So it is difficult in terms of trying to combat that, but certainly we'll talk about some methods. What I'm going to cover now is just really looking at some of the sort of understanding the breach impacts. So just go to the next slide. So this slide here is really just depicting what constitutes a cyber attack. So we've got these 14 areas on the right. We call this the iceberg, and really we're just looking at often the tip of the iceberg. Essentially, we're obviously, if we have a breach, we're looking obviously trying to notify our customers. That is obviously mandatory now in terms of a serious breach of personal information with the new Privacy Act. We've obviously regulatory compliance. We might have some public relations that we need to do. We obviously have to improve our cybersecurity controls. We might have some lawyer fees, legal fees, etc. So these are things that, and obviously there's a technical investigation in terms of actually what went wrong or how the attack happened. But often we overlook things that are really beneath the surface. So these may be things like lost value of customer relationships. That can be quite damaging in terms of its long-term effect. We might lose some intellectual property. We might have some operational disruption for quite a period of time, and that can be quite damaging. We might have insurance premium increases and the like. So it's quite important to look at the full picture when you're looking at the breach. So when I was in the USA, had the opportunity through Deloitte to work on one of the largest credit card breaches that had happened in the US at the time. I think it was 45 million credit cards stolen, but then it was found out it was 90 million credit cards, and it was a large retailer. But the amount of disruption that it caused to the business and the uplift required and the investigation cost them tens of millions of dollars. It was quite painful for them, and being a retailer with had not put so much into security, it was quite damaging. So it can be quite an aftermath in terms of a breach. In terms of just looking at the graph on the left-hand side, so in the days or weeks, obviously trying to really stop the compromise and remediate those controls. Obviously, make sure that you've got a good communication plan in terms of getting that out into the media, and you've got to be careful in terms of what that comms is going to be about, and you need to make sure that you've actually done some due diligence and investigation before you actually go public, because that can do more damage than good as well. So you really need to understand what's happening. And then in the weeks and months, obviously there may be a requirement, obviously, to prepare for the legal action, obviously looking at regulatory and audit issues, and obviously managing your stakeholder relationships. And then obviously in the years or months and years to come, you've obviously got to repair the damage to the business and redesign your processes. So it can be quite a long recovery, and often people think, you might be able to get over the breach in a month, but there can be those after effects. We had one small to medium organization, 20 to 30 people, unfortunately got breached about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was through hackers offshore, for a country that you might expect a breach to come from. And what happened is they were selling goods online through taking transactions through credit cards. And what happened is that attackers actually got hold of compromised their website, put another frame on top of their website. So it looked like the same website as they had designed. But what was happening is the customers were actually entering their credit card details into the attacker's webpage, and that information was obviously going up to the attackers. And then the customers had to enter their credit card details again. So obviously that was unfortunately not something they were expecting. And so they had quite a large breach, and they were actually, so there's a PCI standard, which is a payment card industry standard, that mandates merchants to be at for a certain level of transactions to have certain security controls in. So there's different levels. There's level 1 through 4. Level 4 is a merchant that doesn't have too many transactions online. So they were in that category. They suddenly, because of that breach, had to comply with level 1 requirements, which is over 300 controls. And so that was quite a large impact. It cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to get that to get those controls in place. So for a small to medium enterprise, especially in New Zealand, there are quite a number of them. It can be quite damaging in terms of these breaches. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm just going to briefly touch on cyber insurance. I would imagine many of you are familiar with it, but I will touch on a little bit of this. So we're seeing definitely an increase in organizations looking at that. Now, cyber insurance can certainly complement your cyber protection, certainly can help with costs to remediate the breach or respond to the breach in terms of forensic investigations and notifying affected parties, etc. Can certainly help you with the liability for the loss of the breach of the data, also help with regulatory fines or penalties. And then it can help with some business disruptions costs in terms of if that disruption was caused by some sort of hack or a malware attack. So there can be certain cover associated with that. Let's go to the next one. But I think when you're considering cyber insurance, I think it's very important to kind of look at these 5 different areas. So you want to make sure that you're understanding your risk exposure. So it's all very good and well to get cyber insurance, but if your controls are quite weak or you don't really understand your risk exposure, it's going to be quite hard to claim if you've left your front door open and the attackers can come straight in, or the thieves can come straight in. Then obviously then it's going to be quite difficult to claim. So you really need to understand the risk exposure. And in the claims process, in the underwriting process, typically you're going to have you'll have the insurance company do a self-assessment. So you'll have to fill out some sort of self-assessment. They might ask for a third party to come and do a risk assessment to make sure that they've got comfort on the exposure, and then they will figure out the actual policy and underwrite the insurance. So you definitely need to understand those complexities and policies. They can vary a lot, and there will be considerable time from the insurance company to understand what the exposures are, and there's a lot of different cover in terms of looking at privacy breaches or network security or media, cyber extortion, data asset loss, etc. So some of them can be quite complicated, and then there's a lot to get through in terms of understanding that. The other thing is just making sure that you're actually balancing your premium costs. So premium costs can be in the thousands, tens of thousands, etc., depending on the cover that you're after, whether you're covering $1 million or above, and depending on the actual type of exposure that you're trying to cover. But it's important to make sure that you understand the cost of that premium versus the actual cost of implementing the controls, so you can make some sort of informed decision around that. And then really, for a small to medium enterprise, it might be maybe worth it, but it may not be, because you're actually going to actually be able to implement the controls that are needed to mitigate the risk. So you definitely need to do your due diligence. And then, just as I mentioned, just understanding that claims process up front. You need to make sure that you need to understand that if you actually understand your control environment well, if you've got good controls in a certain area, then you might not specifically need cover for that, because you're quite your controls are quite strong in that area. So you just need to weigh all of that up. And then I think lastly is really just making sure that you do have that incident management process, because as Werner indicated, that most organizations would probably have a breach, or they would be exposed to a breach, and it's only a matter of time. So it's really making sure that you've actually got a very strong incident management program in place. That's extremely important. And that's probably one of the first things that you want to do. I'll just quickly touch on privacy. Again, quite a very large topic in itself, but I'll just touch on some of the key highlights. So obviously, we've had the New Zealand Privacy Act updated in 2020, December of 2020. We've obviously had GDPR come into effect, which is the General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU, which came into effect in May of 2018. So that has just really raised the awareness and the importance of data privacy. Customers are getting more savvy in terms of what organizations are doing with their data. So you really need to have good programs from a compliance perspective to make sure that you are complying with these acts. Obviously, with mandatory breach notification now, you really need to understand what sorts of data you hold on an individual, how they might need to get access to that data, if they need to correct it, and what happens if that data was to be breached. Is that going to cause some sort of serious harm from a financial perspective, from an ability to have someone gain employment, or from a health and safety perspective if it's sort of vulnerable information about vulnerable individuals. So you need to understand that complexity of your data, so that if it did get breached, then you have a plan around that disclosure and notification. I think it's also important to make sure that you are tailoring your privacy program for the actual industry. So obviously with insurance and banking, especially insurance, you might be looking at quite a lot of medical data. And so obviously looking at the Health Information Privacy Code, which has also been updated. So you need to make sure you're across that. But it's really, in terms of that, it's really understanding the importance of actually protecting personal information from a medical perspective, because that can cause some serious harm if that got into the wrong hands. A lot of privacy now is obviously about building that trust and confidence. So you want to actually get closer to the consumer. You want to actually target the consumer from a personalized service perspective, but you need to gain that trust, and you actually need to be able to make sure you've got the right controls to protect that data, and then gain that trust, because then that individual is going to, or the customer is going to be able to give you more data to be able to do more with the data. So what we've seen organizations do is do a lot of sort of data mapping exercises and utilize privacy management tools to help them understand the types of data, do the privacy impact assessments over the data, and then put the right sort of controls in place. So those tools are quite effective now in terms of helping some of that, in terms of getting across to your program. Because in New Zealand, we find that the privacy officer might be part of a legal function or a risk function, but that's only part of their job, and then it's quite difficult to actually get across the organisation. So you almost need a change program and build that culture into the organisation to actually embed some of those cultural values and principles that you need. And then lastly, around ethics and values. So there's a lot of talk around data ethics and making sure your algorithms are not introducing bias, especially from a privacy perspective. So early days in that space in New Zealand, but there are organisations working on this, and we're working with our Dutch colleagues to look more into this space. So we've talked a lot about all the things that our attackers are doing and the world that we live in, and obviously cyber is very important in terms of the board agendas and executives, and it is quite a complex thing, but I guess you need to take some sort of pragmatic approach as well, and you do need to understand that risk and make sure it's right sized for your organisation. There's a lot of priorities for an organisation to deal with, not just cyber and privacy, and so you need to actually understand your threat and risk landscape. So just go to the next slide. So what can you do about it? Really, I think there's quite a bit you can do about it, but I guess at a high level, really trying to make sure that you have that sort of coordinated governance model, which really means that you have your executives and board members very involved in what's going on. And so there's a sort of a good communication bridge between management and the executives and the board, and making sure that you're communicating any issues, any threats, how your cyber and privacy programs are going, what's the maturity across that, because the threat landscape does certainly change, and it's trying to adapt to that landscape to make sure that everyone's on the same page and you're actually communicating the risks effectively. So that's important, obviously, in terms of that board executive oversight and management. But I think equally important is just really making sure you've got that community of learning. And so that's not only from internal to the organisation, but making sure that you're utilising third parties, subject matter experts, you're looking at things like NZ or New Zealand Task Force, or others in the community, to actually learn about the topic and get that awareness across the business, and also communicating to your customers effectively, obviously if there is a breach, but in the event that you're actually raising your own maturity, communicating that and making sure that you're communicating to your customers that you're taking cyber seriously. So, and the other one is just really taking stock of what your cyber program looks like. What are the important assets that you have, data assets? What are the important business processes that you have? What are your supplier relationships look like? What do your third parties look like? And what does that ecosystem look like in terms of identifying the key risks and threats to your environment? So we have on the right-hand side, a little graphic there that talks about governance, but really it's also about secure, vigilant, and resilient from our perspective. Secure is just really about the fundamental security controls that Werner talked about in terms of implementing some of those controls within the organization. Vigilance is more around the people and the culture and making sure that you've got that awareness across the organization, and resilience is obviously around the ability to be resilient and respond and recover from an actual attack and incident. So it's making sure that you've got all those three areas covered. That's critical. Just quickly touching on some of the future trends. So we've talked a lot about cyber hygiene. So these are all the things that you typically expect an organization to do nowadays. So these are your annual or biannual 6-monthly penetration tests that you might do on your external websites, you might do on your network, you might do on your critical applications. So all of that is fundamental now, and there are a lot of in-house teams that are being built to do this sort of thing, or you can get external providers. There's a lot around automation in terms of making sure that you're trying to automate security controls to the ability that you can. So that might be your identity and access management processes, your security scanning of vulnerabilities, or your monitoring, being able to pick up those sort of user behavior anomalies in your actual cyber threat landscape or your actual infrastructure. So it's a lot of work being done around automation. Secure by design is really just making sure upfront through your implementation of any sort of IT project or business project that has a implication around cyber. So you might be collecting a lot of personal information or sensitive data, or you might have a critical business process that you're about to stand up, or you're doing a migration of a payroll system. So all of those changes in the environment, or your digital transformation, you might be putting in a new claims process, for example. All of those types of things security needs to be considered along the way, because if you don't, that's where these exposures are more apparent later on, and you need to make sure that you're not wasting money at the back end of the project to then quickly try to implement security. I won't touch on all of these, but I think another big one is really just around self-regulation. So making sure that you're actually doing, from an organization, you're utilizing the internal audit team, or you're doing your own sort of line of defense. They're actually doing some self-regulation around the types of controls that are needed. So they're doing that from an ongoing perspective to make sure that you're not exposing yourself and before an attack actually happens. So I think that's going to be really important to make sure that you're doing this on a frequent basis to look at your control environment. Pause there. Let's maybe go back on just some personal tips, I think, and if we touch on some of the things that maybe folks can do from a cyber hygiene perspective when they're working from home. We might just quickly touch on some of the things that you could do there.
Yes, great. Thanks, Raj. So when the new norm has now settled in and majority of people have the ability to work from home, some of the things to just be aware of, and just some general tips and tricks for when you're at home, is if you're receiving any suspicious emails, just because you're not in the office doesn't mean you don't need to report them. So if it's something, whether it's coming from a CFO or a CEO, or whether it's from one of your colleagues, if it looks suspicious, rather report the email or pick up the phone and give them a call and ask them if the actual email was sent through to yourself. When you're working from home as well, just be aware of your network and your wireless network that you might potentially be connected to. Just be aware of who's potentially connecting to your network, and monitor to see if there's anybody else who potentially could be on your network listening or monitoring any of your traffic. If you have any online services, as we mentioned earlier, there's a low adoption rate as we progressively become older in terms of adopting things like multi-factor authentication. So if your account does have the ability, or the service does have the ability to enable multi-factor authentication, it's a couple of seconds of inconvenience potentially, but it could potentially save you from either a financial or any other type of loss that you might have. And then I think the key one there is just to remain vigilant when you're at home. So anything that looks suspicious, report it. Make sure that your systems are up to date. Make sure that you've regularly patched everything, your antivirus, etc. is up to date as well. From a business perspective, be aware of the services that you're exposing to your employees when they're actually working from home. Do you have the necessary controls in place to actually protect those services? As COVID ramped up and organizations started working from home, a lot of people were trying to just get services available so that businesses could operate. But a lot of the security and the protection of those systems has generally not been a forethought, and now retrospectively organizations need to go back and secure those specific services that they offer. So it's just maintaining that vigilance in terms of understanding if something comes through, if you're not aware, if you're not sure, rather ask. And then just, I think we're leaving it just here with a quote that it says, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and only a few minutes of a cyber incident to ruin it.
Wow, that was really interesting. Thank you so much for your time and all that information. Does anyone who has connected today have any questions for Raj or Werner? While we're waiting for those to come through, I certainly do. Just touching on your last topic around working from home, how helpful is it to regularly update your passwords? And if multi-factor authentication is not available, is there any other things that people can do as far as regular?
Yes, definitely. So as we're progressing, we're hearing a lot more about passwords becoming obsolete and they're no longer relevant because you need to have long passwords or you have multi-factor authentication. I think getting into a practice of regularly changing your password every 3 to 6 months or every year at least, based on the type of service you consume, where you do have the ability, switch on multi-factor authentication purely because it provides you with that additional protection. If the service does not provide you with multi-factor authentication, then there's, I think, two key questions. One is, do I really need the service? Am I happy to actually provide my information to a service that does not take my security or my information seriously? And then the second one there is just, if you are doing or signing up to a service that does not provide multi-factor authentication as a protection mechanism, do they have the necessary visibility for me to actually log in online and be able to see where it's been logged into, or do I have the ability to use the service once and then can I delete or remove my information afterwards?
Okay, and is having VPN on a home network useful?
It's always an interesting discussion in terms of having a VPN on. I think the key question there is to look at why you would actually require a VPN. If it's for corporate services, you need to connect back into your office, then definitely yes. For personal use, generally, if you wanted to keep your online browsing, etc., anonymous, then there's definitely merit in using a VPN, where you can actually potentially protect yourself online. Definitely try and use it. But it weighs up the merits, the pros and the cons as well of why you're actually signing up for an online VPN service.
I think the other thing for us also on the password piece is just, often sometimes folks might use, they shouldn't, but they might use the same password for work and home, and obviously that's a big no-no. And you want to make sure that definitely, I think obviously the ideal is to move away from passwords, but obviously that's going to take some time. And obviously, if your password does get compromised and you are using that password for other accounts, obviously, then that opens up that whole avenue. So I think it's certainly in this day and age, definitely get advice to regularly change those. Can be inconvenient, but the ability for someone to gain access to something is quite easy.
Sure. You touched on the data protection regulations in the European Union. Beyond the Privacy Act and the Crimes Act in New Zealand, do you think there will be a move towards something similar to what there is in the UK and EU? Or do you think there's a need in New Zealand for those type of regulations to emerge?
Yeah, I mean, I think the New Zealand Privacy Act's obviously gone through the refresh, so there were some, I know that GDPR was obviously looked at in terms of that. We're still missing a few things out of GDPR, like right to be forgotten and the like. So I think possibly over time we might get to that. I think it's more just the fact that New Zealand, I think our law is obviously principle based, and I think that to some degree it works for New Zealand. I think there's obviously the thing around adequacy, which is making sure that we're able to transfer data between the different countries. And so right now New Zealand has adequacy, with the EU, that may change. So we might need to look at things around that. But I think for the most part, we try to adopt some of that. I think GDPR though, and probably the CCPA, the California Privacy Act, is probably benchmark still in terms of that regulation. So, and I think the other thing with the Privacy Act is that the fines are not a lot, right? They're $10,000 per breach. So I think the Commission is really going after basing the regulation more on from a reputational perspective. I guess that mandatory breach notification. So I think that's really where the pressure is going to come for organisations to make sure that they've got their game up.
Sure. I've got a question come through from stating some product providers are starting to ask for annual data security checks. What areas should be checked for these type of reviews?
That's a good question. From a data security perspective, I think first it comes back to one of my points before around just understanding the data footprint and understanding the sensitive data. So you really need to get a handle on personal information, IP, financial data. Even there might be data around some of the IT controls itself, so that can be sensitive in terms of security exposure. So there's quite a wide range of data that you need to understand, that footprint. So if you start to categorize that into some sort of classification level, so there's going to be things like sensitive data, confidential, restricted, internal, public, that sort of classification, and then from there you can then start to adapt, put the right controls in. So definitely access control, privileged access is critical. So making sure that the IT team have good controls around privileged access is essentially where you have elevated access. You can basically do anything on a system or a computer. So you need to have good controls around that, I think. And then really just making sure any data that's sitting on a particular system, you're doing penetration tests against that, so that data is not exposed to the outside. So there are a lot of good frameworks out there. There's CIS controls, there's ISO, there's NIST. We even have our own frameworks. Obviously, RB's come out with some guidance as well. So there's lots of good material out there, but I think, from our perspective, I think it'll be certainly access control is critical, vulnerability management, and logging and monitoring, making sure that you understand any changes to the data that could be compromised.
Okay, last question. Ransomware, to pay or not to pay?
I think that's always an interesting discussion. I think the general way that we approach it is generally to not to pay, because by paying it, you're actually enabling them and you're funding future endeavors that they potentially might be undertaking. As a worst case scenario, if the organization does not have the ability to actually recover any key systems or data that were affected by this ransomware, then as a last resort is to potentially look at it, but only once you've actually exhausted all potential avenues, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid funding any of these cyber criminals, any of these malicious threat actors to actually then go and potentially target other organizations. Unless you're sitting with ransomware that is very targeted because they're looking for a specific financial gain, because they know that the organization can afford it, general guidelines would be make sure you regularly test your backup processes, your disaster recovery processes, and as well as your business continuity plans, just to actually understand, can I live without my data if it gets lost, or what am I going to do if I cannot actually get through to it? It's also key there, if you are hit by ransomware and you are struggling, reach out to organizations that can potentially assist you. So you can report issues to CERT New Zealand. There's organizations like Deloitte, the GCSB, that you can also reach out to for any potential assistance and guidance as well.
Okay. I think we'll call it a close there. Again, thank you so much for your time. And for FSC members that have joined us today, you'll receive a link to this webinar in the next FSC newsletter. And it's also available on the FSC page on YouTube. So thank you very much for your time and have a great day.